Hej, trevligt att se er här. Jag heter som sagt Per Ahlström, kommer från Sverige som ni kanske vet. Jag bor i Uppsala, jag kom från Göteborg från början. Jag började tidigt titta på fåglar och åkte som ung väldigt ofta till Skän och tittade på fåglar. Det var nog min favoritlokal när jag var ung. Jag ska förresten, det är meningen att jag ska prata på engelska sedan också, kommer jag på. Nu börjar jag på svenska här. Jag kan prata på vilket språk ni vill utom dansk. Måske kan det snacka lite dansk, men engelska, jag har förberett föredraget på engelska. Föredrar ni att jag tar engelska? Nej, ja, nej, ja. Okej, jag kör det på engelska. Jag tar det på väldigt långsam och tydlig engelska. Men jag fortsätter att prata lite svenska nu bara om min barndom på Skän. Det var fantastiskt för mig att komma dit och titta på alla träckfåglar som passerade över till Sverige. Och när de passerade Skän så koncentrerades de ju väldigt mycket. Sedan när de kom över till Sverige så vet vi aldrig vart de tog vägen. De spred ut sig över hela Bohuslän och Halland så att de försvann där. Så att det var mycket, mycket bättre att åka till Danmark och titta på fåglarna. Många av mina svenska kamrater, de var så väldigt intresserade av sina svenska listor så de vägrade att åka till Danmark utan de bara stannade i Sverige och letade efter någon enstaka sortstak uppe i Bohuslän istället. Men jag tyckte det var mycket roligare i Danmark. Okej, nu ska jag prata om identification of vagrant Asian leaf warblers in Europe. Och I've been studying leaf warblers for quite many years. It started when I was, I don't know, maybe my early 20s when I started traveling to Asia, and I've been traveling quite a lot in Asia since then. I've been, lots of different places, spent a lot of time there looking at leaf warblers and other things. So this is a summary of what I and others have learned over the years with respect to the ones that are rare in Europe, the ones that occasionally turn up here as vagrants. So just as a general overview, there's happened a lot with respect to taxonomy in recent years. And for example, in 1986, there were 39 species of leaf warblers in the world, whereas the latest edition of Howard and Moore checklist recognized 64 species. I haven't checked the latest BirdLife checklist. That I saw it for the first time today. I don't know how many species there are. But anyway, the number has increased enormously, and most of this increase is due to species being split. So one species having multiple subspecies is split into several species, or two or more. In one case, there's one species, the golden spectacled warbler, which is in the genus Circus, so not the same genus as the traditional leaf warblers. It's now 6 different species, and 2 of those were described as new species to science. But you recognize the chiff-chaff, the grandsanger, I believe, in Danish. Bonelli-sanger, is it Bonelli-sanger? Okay. Was divided into 2 species, the Arctic warbler into 3 species, the live leaf warbler, that's an Asian species, 3 species, pale-legged, another Asian, 2 species, Palaces, the fogle-kongesanger, is that right? Up to 5 species. Tickles, leaf warbler, 3 species, including 1 new to science, yellow-browed, hvidbrunsanger, is it? There's 2 different species, white-tailed, 2. So, and 3 more species were described as new species. So this happened a lot, and there's been a lot of turmoil in the taxonomy. The taxonomy is not being stable at all, so lots of changes. And this is just to show you a general overview of the relationships among those. I don't expect you to read any names, but if you just look at those ones in red, they were previously placed in the genus Seicercus, these ones here. And they look quite different from the others. So that's the reason why they were placed in Seicercus. But as you can see here, they are, we say, nested within the phylloscopus leaf warblers. So these ones are actually more closely related to these leaf warblers than these leaf warblers are to these leaf warblers. So the molecular analysis that we did revealed some surprises with respect to relationships. And based on this, the Howard and Moore checklist, they suggested that Phylloscopus should be split into different genera. So they proposed these horrible names. Radina for this group here, Abronis for this group, Phylloscopus is just these few here, which include the, is it Fetis? In Fetis Grandsanger? Is that the right Danish names? For Löfsanger? Löfsanger. Fetis, that's German.
Yes.
Anyway. So that was Phylloscopus according to them, and all of these were Seicercus according to Howard and Moore. I'm not entirely happy with this, and I'm working on a revised taxonomy here. We've got a new phylogeny that's not been published yet. So anyway, there's unfortunately I apologize for that, but there will be more changes. It's a bit annoying with those taxonomies that change things. So we just look at one of these groups, the Pallas's leaf warbler complex, Fågelkongesanger komplexet. So this was previously treated as a single species with several subspecies. One subspecies being Proregulus up in Siberia, northern China. That's the one that turns up in Denmark regularly. And then Knudsen in this part of China was considered actually the same as this. It was synonymized with Proregulus, so the name didn't exist. I mean, the name existed, but it wasn't used at all. It was considered to be just identical with this one. And then there was Chloronotus here in the eastern Himalayas, and Simensis in western Himalayas. And this Foresti in China and Yunanensis in China were considered to be just the same as Chloronotus. So they were not recognized. So the ones with asterisks here were not recognized at all. So there were 3 subspecies recognized. But when we started studying these in the field and studying their vocalizations, we realized that they differed very much. And Proregulus, can you hear this clearly, or shall I make it louder? It's got a beautiful song. I love that song. It's fantastic. And Knudsen. It's a very different song. Very, very different. And then Foresti from central China. Again, a very, very different song compared to... And remarkably, this one's got 2 completely different song types. 2 very different song types. Okay, got to stop it there. And we'll see. Yes, the Chinese leaf warbler. Again, a very, very, very different song. And surprisingly, This one's got another type of vocalization, which I don't think is a proper song actually. I think it's some sort of contact alarm call given on the breeding grounds, mostly, but it's not a proper song. I've seen both females and males at the nest giving this type of vocalization. So anyway, they look very similar to each other. This one is the one that's most different looking because it's more brightly colored than the other, especially the supercilium, whereas the others are very similar to each other. And actually, even though these photos look a bit different, they are so similar that I cannot distinguish between them in the field when I see them only. Not even in the hand, actually, can I distinguish between them. They're so similar. But the songs are very different. This one, the Chinese leaf warbler, is more different because you see it doesn't have any dark bar here, whereas the others usually have a dark patch right at the base of the secondaries. Also, its head pattern is a less clear. You can't see very clearly here because if you'd seen the bird from above, you would have seen that this pale stripe is less distinct than here. But basically they're all very similar, but with some minor differences. But vocalization is very different, and genetically they're quite different as well. And as you can see here on this time scale, they've been separated for quite substantial periods. We've got like 2.5 million years between some of these here, and this one is close to 7.5 million years. And Yunanensis is actually, we call it sympatric. It means it occurs together with, it breeds in the same area as Foresti and Knudsensis, and they don't seem to interbreed at all. They're completely segregated. So we've definitely got, I would say we've got 5 different species here, according to my notion anyway, and I think most people agree with that these days. These were treated as the same species previously. The yellow-browed warbler was treated as a single species, and then the Ahlströhms warbler, which breeds in Central Asia with a population in Central China as well, not connected with each other. They're quite geographically separated. They were treated as single species, but they differ mainly in vocalizations, and they're genetically very different. But also the plumages are, in fresh plumage, quite different. So in fresh autumn plumage, yellow-browed warbler, Inonatus, has got sort of, even though it's called Vibrun-sangere, it's got a yellowish tinge to the supercilium, which can be difficult to see, especially in the field. But at least if you have the bird in the hand and look carefully, it's always got a yellowish tinge to the supercilium. Whereas Ahlströhms has got a very buffish, nice buffish tone, so sort of a brownish tinge to the supercilium. Another thing is that Ahlströhms it's like it's been washed out. So it's like it's been put in a washing machine for a while and dried up again after that. So it looks it's less contrastingly patterned overall than yellow-browed. And especially this anterior wing bar, the wing bar on the median covers, is usually not quite white. It's quite often almost the same color as the mantle, but sometimes clearly paler, but it's usually much less contrasting than in yellow-browed. Also the bare parts are usually darker, so the legs are usually darker, the lower mandible is usually darker. So there's a number of differences between those. And here's some birds in the hand. Here's 3 yellow-browed and 1 Ahlströhms, and you can see the same differences again. Look at the median covered bar, look at this nice buffish tinge to the supercilium, and it looks sort of more washed out altogether. And the same characters should be evident here. This bird is very typical because it's got really the same color to the tips of the median coverts. as the mantle. You see there's no contrast really, whereas this yellow-browed's got really nice whitish tips to the coverts. And also bare part coloration, you see there's slight differences, but there's not always much difference in bare part, so that's not really a reliable feature. Look at the supercilium again, and overall more washed out. If you look here, for example, look at the tertials, they're less contrastingly patterned. This is very evident when you have the birds right next to each other, but in the field it can be difficult to judge, because I mean there's a clear contrast anyway, so in the field it can be difficult. In spring though, they can be very, very difficult, because these in this bird you can see that the median covered bar is completely worn off. It's a very worn bird, so it's been worn off almost completely. This bird's got slightly more distinct pale wing bar, but it can be lacking altogether. And even though it does wear also in ewes, the pale tips can actually become paler due to bleaching than in autumn. So ewes often seems to have more of a distinct wing bar in spring than it does in autumn. One good indication anyway is that the supercilium is often quite bufferish and with a contrast to the greater covert bar, whereas in yellow-browed, quite usually it's pretty much the same color here. And in these particular birds you see much paler legs in yellow-browed than in ewes, but there is variation. The best way to distinguish between them is by songs. Now you don't hear the songs very often in Europe though. There's ewes. So ewes also has two different song types, like the some of the birds we looked at before. So two very, very different song types, but they often alternated between. So it gives this double whistle and then this bzzz, buzzing note after that. Sometimes they will just use this double whistle for a long time, and sometimes mainly the buzz, but very often both combined. And the calls are much more commonly heard in Europe, and they really differ quite a lot. So this is yellow-browed. This one here. Stop it. Third one. Basically just the same, even though you can see slight differences in the sonograms. They all sound pretty much the same. But hues, quite different, right? It's much lower pitched, softer. Another individual. Someone there. So there's a lot of variation, but they're all quite different from yellow-browed, right? This is a bit unusual. But strangely, here's the last one. And the last time I was in India in winter, all the birds sounded like this, which is very odd, because that's more similar to yellow-browed than all the others, which I recorded back in the 80s and 90s in the same places. So it seems like, I don't know, something seems to have happened. They seem to have changed their vocalizations in those 30 years, 20, 30 years. I don't know. Or it's just, I found it very odd. I need to look into this. Anyway, that's still distinguishable from yellow-browed, but more similar, I would say, than the other ones. So, the greenish warbler complex, what's that in Danish? Greenish warbler.
Lundsanger.
Sorry?
Lundsanger.
Lundsanger, yeah, same in Swedish. So, Lundsanger is often treated as 3 different species. Two-barred, which in Danish is what? Østlig Lundsanger, yeah. And green warbler, which, what's that called?
Grønsanger.
Okay. So, they're often treated as 3 different species. The Lundsanger here, and another one here, and another one here. And these 2, they meet and overlap geographically in Siberia. And according to lots of old, well, not only old, but according to lots of studies, they don't interbreed where they meet. So they don't mix. So they should be treated as different species. But it's more complicated than that. And it's actually a taxonomist's nightmare. I don't know, I can't think of any case, maybe except some large white-headed gulls, that is so difficult to classify as these warblers in this complex here. And I'll show you. Okay, so I'll just show you what they look like first. So they're all pretty similar, these ones. The northern one, Lundsanger, is very whitish below. It's got a single wing bar usually. There can be a trace of a second wing bar, but usually rather thin single wing bar. The green warbler, it looks very white on this picture, but usually it's got a pale yellow throat and breast, and a pale yellow supercilium, and it's more greenish on the upper parts than Viridanes. And the two-barred has usually, as the name implies, got 2 wing bars, and they're rather broad and long and clear-cut. And then in the Himalayas and central China, we've got the nominate greenish warbler, which is actually somewhat more similar to two-barred. Here's the song of the greenish, the northern greenish. Long drawn out, very varied, nice, pleasant. Okay, and two-barred is fairly similar, or very similar. But the song is actually, it's built up of certain blocks that are, so several notes are repeated in blocks. And with some practice, it's possible to distinguish between those. The birds themselves don't seem to have any problems. It's just us bird watchers who are a bit. And in China and central China and Himalayas, the song is much simpler. It's very short, rather simple structure. Let's see. So here's the call of the greenish. rather simple, almost monosyllabic, slightly disyllabic. Oh, not so clearly. Two-barred is usually more clearly disyllabic. And the green warbler is more similar to two-barred than the greenish. Slightly more slurred, disyllabic. But this complex figure, which is taken from a scientific paper, shows the complexity of this problem, this taxonomic nightmare. So what it's supposed to show is sort of a representation around the Tibetan plateau, the distribution around the Tibetan plateau. So we've got the nominate subspecies here in the Himalayas, we've got obscuratus in central China, and plumitarsus up in northeastern China and Siberia, meeting viridanus, the classic Lundsanger in Siberia and all the way back over to Europe, to Eastern Europe. And then again, throw this Ludlovi meeting Trochiloides in the Himalayas. And this here is the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is found in all living cells, and we've got two different sets of DNA in our cells, or in all those. One is the mitochondrial DNA, and one is the DNA that codes for most of our functions and appearances and things. So the mitochondrial DNA codes for the mitochondria, the power stations in our cells. And according to the mitochondrial DNA, which evolves rather fast, there's two different groups, two different main groups. One comprising Trochiloides, obscuratus central China, and plumitarsus, the two-barred. And the other one comprising the others, so Nitidus, the green warbler, and viridanus up in Siberia, this Ludlovi in the westernmost Himalayas. But according to a much larger study of the entire genome, you can see that there's a lot of mixing here. So these different colors represent the different genetic profiles here. So you see here in northwestern India and Pakistan, there's a mix of birds similar to the Siberian European viridanus and birds from the Himalayas. In central China, you've got some very unique central Chinese birds, but also a mix of Himalayan birds and two-barred. And up in Siberia, there is actually evidence of interbreeding between viridanus and plumitarsus, between the greenish warbler and two-barred warbler, with transfer of genetic material from this one to that one. So it's a very, very, very complex situation. And the question is, how many species are there? What do you think? I can't tell you, I'm sorry. I've given up. And this proves the difficulty of classification and taxonomy. And the reason for this is that evolution is a gradual process. So species diverge gradually from a common ancestor. And since that's a continuous gradual process which might take variously long time in different places, in different lineages, it's difficult to draw a line sometimes and say, now they're different species. So you have to accept that there are problematic species. You just have to live with that. Even though it might hurt that you can't know whether to tick it or not. But you just have to say, okay, that's a fact of life. That's because of evolution. We can't do anything about it. We have to wait 2 million years, if we're still alive then, to see what's happened. So, the greenish warblers and the two-barred warblers are very similar to the Arctic warblers. Arctic warblers breeding up in northern Siberia, all the way to northern Norway, northern Sweden. And the Arctic warbler is actually usually most similar to the greenish warbler in that the wing bar is very similar. The head pattern is usually more striking in the Arctic warbler compared to the greenish warblers. Greenish warblers usually got rather poorly marked laurel stripe. There's usually like a dark spot in front of the eye and then not so clear dark stripe there. And this pale in front of the eye usually almost meets over the bill. So they look rather neat and friendly, whereas Arctic looks usually more aggressive with this darker laurel stripe and shorter supercilium and usually darker, more clear-cut dark stripe through the eye. Also, Arctic's usually got a larger, stronger bill, usually more dark at the tip of the lower mandible than in greenish. On average, got paler legs and so on. There's a number of differences. Two-barred usually differs quite clearly from Arctic in having broader, longer, more clear-cut wing bars, especially here on the greater coverts. And the song of Arctic is very unique, very distinctive, very different from the song of greenish and two-barred. And so is the call. That's the call of Arctic, just a very sharp zit. So in fresh plumage in the autumn, two-barred is most easily distinguished from Arctic by the wing bar. So very broad, clear-cut, straight wing bars that are very long. You see very long, straight, clear-cut wing bars, whereas Arctic's got much thinner, shorter, and more diffuse wing bars. That's the best feature, really. But it can be difficult, and as you can see here, Arctic can actually show two wing bars, just like the two-barred, and two-barred can have only one wing bar, and these birds are adult in the autumn, and adult birds, they don't molt until they reach the winter quarters. So when they migrate south in the autumn, the plumage is almost, well, it's close to 1 year old. So these feathers can become very, very worn, and these wing bars can be much narrower and less distinct, and this anterior wing bar can be totally worn off. So adult birds in the autumn can be really difficult to distinguish between. The call is always the best. If they call, that's always the best feature. And the head pattern of the two-barred is more similar to Arctic than the greenish warbler. But there are other slight differences as well that you can look for, which you can't really see clearly in these pictures, but Arctic looks more drawn out. It's slightly larger and heavier and looks slightly more drawn out, whereas two-barred usually tends to look slightly more large-headed, slightly smaller bill, slightly shorter tail, slightly more compact. On average, the legs are paler. On average, there's more contrast on the lower mandible, but they really can be very, very similar. So here you can see fresh birds. Look at the wing bars here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pale there. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5. There's only 3 pale there, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, almost 7 there. And you can see that these are almost square, very clear cut, whereas this is just like a little white comma. The Arctic warbler has got a large distribution, all the way from northern Norway to Alaska. And there have been 2 subspecies described on Sakhalin Island, Kamchatka, the Kuril Islands, and in Japan, on the different Japanese islands. And we studied these morphologically, vocally, and genetically, and we proposed that these are actually 3 different species rather than 1 species. And one of them, this Xanthodrias, occurs on most of the Japanese islands, except the northernmost, Hokkaido, where Examinandus occurs, which also occurs on Kamchatka, the Kuril Islands, and Sakhalin. And plumage-wise, they're very, very, very similar. This plumage shows a slightly unusual individual, which is very yellow, but on average, it's slightly more yellow on the other parts than the others. On average, it's got a longer outermost primary than the others. And this one's got on average a longer outermost primary than this one, but they really are very similar on plumage and structure and so on. But the vocalizations, again, differ very much. And here's the song of a northern bird. So just this long rattle, very uniform long rattle. Very strange song. And Examinandus, quite different, very stuttering, much shorter, and very stuttering song. And it's stuttering because it's got these repeated elements. You can see here, AAB, 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 so just repeated like that. And Xanthodrias from the main Japanese islands has got an even more stuttering song. That's called now. So even more complex song than Examinandus. And if you look at Examinandus, it's got some very, very thin elements here at the beginning of every note. They're always lacking in Xanthodrias. So there are consistent differences between those in songs and also in chords. This is not agreeing with me today. That's the call of the northern one, the call that you're most likely to hear in Denmark. So just a very short tz, tz, tz. Examinandus from Hokkaido, Sakhalin, Kamchatka. Very similar, but more sort of rattling, slightly rattling. And then Xanthodrias from the main southern Japanese islands is very different. It's a very low-pitched song, chord. And also genetically they're very different, and they've been separated for quite a substantial period. So Xanthodrias from the others, like over 2.5 million years according to our estimates. So they're very distinctive, even though they look very similar. They really are very distinctive birds. We could actually take a break here. I think that might be a good time for that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right?
One question. Hvordan ved man, hvor længe en art har været udskilt fra en anden art?
Lidt højere, Anders.
Förlåt, jag hörde inte riktigt.
Når I siger, eller når du siger, at det er de arter, der har været længst udskilt fra den oprindelige form, hvordan ved man, hvilken periode der er?
Det, när det gäller sådana, when it comes to species that are closely related, that are as closely related as these ones, we can't use any fossil data. They're too young. It's too recent. We can't use that. So we have to compare the genes and use what's called a molecular clock, which is a very, very rough estimate. So all of those dates have got very broad confidence intervals. So you can't really say. When I say 2.5 million years, it could be between 1.5 and 3.5 maybe. So it's a very broad general thing, but it's based on the molecular clock, which according to which these genes they change gradually with sort of a clock-like speed rate. But it's very, you have to take it very. You can't really trust the exact dates, but what you, in most cases at least, can trust is the difference between them. So if there's a very deep divergence between them, that's a good indication that they really have been separated for a long period of time. If they're very similar, there could actually have been some interbreeding between them, and then DNA transferred from one to the other, and then they've become homogenized, and then maybe they've separated again. So they could still have been separated for a long time, even if they're very similar. But if they're very different, usually they have been separated for a long period of time. All right? Some beer? Is öl?